Tonight, we are going to lecture on the coastal plain ecoregions, and hopefully we will finish the ecoregions of the Mid-South lecture, and then that will set us up to be ready for a different topic for next week to begin with. I'm going to go ahead and get ready to share my screen. Okay. All right. Awesome. Okay, so we've got here, just taking a look, we got Jaron and Ryan, Laura and Sarah, Brandon. We got James, Corley, Clayton, Phoebe, Jacob, Juliet. Awesome. There's a few people that hadn't added yet, hasn't joined. We'll hopefully expect here shortly. But in the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Did anybody hear this thing record? It did, right? It acknowledged that it is recording, I think.
Yeah,
It did.
Good. Okay, perfect. All right, let's get going, gang. I appreciate everybody's time. I do have one announcement to make. I have to end class early tonight. So what I'm probably going to do is we'll take a break at the halfway point, but I'm going to go a little bit longer than I normally would. And we're gonna stop lecturing a few minutes before 7. I've got some donors here in Jackson that I have to go visit with, and so I'm going to have to cut off class a little bit early tonight. My apologies for that. Okay, here we go. When we left off last time, we had finished talking about the region to the east, which is largely Middle Tennessee and Kentucky, northern Alabama. It also gets up into southwesternmost Ohio, southern Indiana, and the southernmost tip of Illinois. And that region collectively, who remembers the name of that level 3 ecoregion? I'm gonna call on people if I don't hear from anybody here. So, Sarah, what do you remember the name of the broader ecoregion that encompasses that area? Ryan says Pennyroyal Plain. So Ryan, that's a level 4 region, right? That's the real precise levels. What's the one that's bigger as you zoom out?
Interior low plateau.
Yeah, the interior low plateau. I'll also accept interior plateaus, either way. Now what we're going to do, though, is we're going to cross over into the western Tennessee region. This is called the coastal plains. In general, at a very large scale, we call it the coastal plain. Remember, that's the area we talked about that the fall line drops off into. And by and large, the coastal plain of southeastern North America is, what's about the maximum age on the coastal plain? Does anybody remember how, approximately how old are those, is that inner coastline?
Is it like 65 million?
Yeah, that's really good. Now the coastal plain sediments are older than that. They do go back into you have some things from like the late Cretaceous and stuff, but generally it's that coastline, that innermost edge, roughly dates to about 65 million years ago. Yes, and that's the end of the Cretaceous period. And that is also, as we'll learn, the time of the extinction of dinosaurs and the transition of a whole era. We go from the Mesozoic era into the Cenozoic era. So again, just as a reminder, make sure you are memorizing your eras, periods, and the epochs of the Cenozoic. Laura?
When you say innermost edge of that coastal plain, are you referring to this black outline that marks the ecoregion, or are you referring to the innermost coastline of modern day?
Well, this was so this line here that I'm kind of tracing with my arrow is the innermost edge of that ecoregion. but it also is the innermost edge of the American coastline. But at 65 million years ago, the Gulf of Mexico came all the way up to that line. And
Perfect, thank you.
then what's been happening since 65 million years ago is that line has been progressively receding toward the present day Gulf of Mexico. So it has pulled back south all the way down to the Gulf where it is today. Okay. So if you look at the entire coastal plains at a large scale, then we can classify that, of course, into many regions. And at a level 3 ecoregion, we're going to call this broad region is sort of, one of them is called the southeastern plains. And that's the one we're going to focus on right now. The southeastern plains level 3 ecoregion is part of the region that you see here that has, that is labeled both part of 74, this area here, as well as 65 here on the right. We're going to reserve this small sliver over here on the left that is in purple, because that's actually another level 3 ecoregion. The Mississippi alluvial plain will come in. Actually, I'm sorry. I think I told you wrong on that. That's all part of the southeastern plains, I believe. So we're going to go now and start rolling through these. We're going to start here on the eastern side of the coastal plain and then proceed west toward the Mississippi River. In general, I think what I was just trying to indicate here is that there are sort of three general subdivisions within this. The southeastern plains, which is shown here by region 65, it tends to be a little bit more rolling, upland, even has some hilly regions to it. Then the region shown here, 74, Mississippi Valley Lush Plains. That's an area that's very flat. In few places, it's cut by rivers. It's a little dissected. And then the Mississippi alluvial plain is the actual bottomlands of the Mississippi River. Okay. We're going to jump right in. So number one, this map dates to the 1990s. I think it was made the year after I graduated high school in 1997. And each state was mapped by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. And the EPA had these maps produced for each state. Well, of Tennessee and the surrounding states like Kentucky and Alabama and Arkansas, our state was mapped first. And then the other states were mapped later. Well, what I noticed as a young professor was that if you were to look at the ecoregions at a very fine scale, the level 4 ecoregions recognized for Tennessee, anytime you hit the state boundary, it seemed that if you looked over in like adjacent Arkansas, they split things a bit more finely than we did. Same thing when you looked at North Carolina. They had regions that were recognized that we did not. And so that mainly is a reflection, I think, of the fact that Tennessee was done first. And then as these other states were mapped, they had different concepts and they mapped things at a little bit different scale or at a finer level. So about 10 years ago, I decided that it didn't appear that the EPA was going to update their map for Tennessee. They still have not. So I went in and worked with the student, and just to have at least a working map that, you know, I could use for teaching and stuff. And I ended up remapping the ecoregions of Tennessee. And I've shown this map, I think, a couple times. You may not have known exactly what it was and how it differed. But I especially did it because I was unhappy with Tennessee's, the coastal plain maps for West Tennessee. They left a lot to be desired. So I took this map as it is and started remapping West Tennessee's ecoregions. And this is kind of what it looks like. It's very different, you know, in some respects. And we're going to walk through this. And this map is in this revised version of the PowerPoint, which I need to post, and you'll have that. And so the first region of these that we're going to go through is what's called the Transition Hills. This is a small area of southwestern Middle Tennessee, a little bit of the northwest corner of Alabama, and the northeast corner of Mississippi. Then we're going to talk about, I'm just going to show these first sort of sequentially, and then we'll go through them kind of in sequence. Fall Line Hills, the Black Belt Prairie, the Patontock Ridge, the Flatwoods ecoregion, the northern hilly coastal plain, the Luss Plain, the Luss Plain meander belts, the Luss Bluff, northern back swamps, Pleistocene valley trains, and the northern Holocene meander belts. So these are all the ecoregions at a level 4 perspective that we need to talk about for West Tennessee. And again, many of these do extend into neighboring states. All right, next up, and you'll notice that when you look at my map, that it actually follows much more closely in alignment with the geology map for Tennessee. So just take a look at that for a second, and then you'll see it here. The way this differs from the preceding map that was originally published is many of these north-south bands that you see here were they had stopped according to the previous EPA region map for Tennessee. So, for example, to Black Belt Prairie, or let's say take the Flatwoods for example, which is this orange region right here. In the original EPA ecoregion map, the Flatwoods were mapped as only extending north to about where my arrow is. That geology, though, and that land type actually extends all the way up into Kentucky. It just becomes very slender and just a few miles wide. So I have actually gone ahead and mapped that completely throughout. And the same thing for these other regions like the Fall Line Hills and so forth. Okay, we can click in and take a look at that map if you want. There's a zoomable map. There is a place I'm going to actually click on that, and we're going to get sort of dig in. Let's just briefly talk about the approximate age of these sediments. So again, linking this up to the geologic timescale, the Transition Hills is a region that is dominated by Cretaceous sediments. It's fairly standard practice in the world of geology to use a K for Cretaceous. For example, later I'm going to talk about the KT boundary, which is an important geologic boundary layer. And that K means Cretaceous, even though the word Cretaceous begins with a C. Okay. Of this region, there are 2 formations. You don't need to know the formations. I just want you to kind of be exposed to the general concepts of what I'm saying. So there's the KE. We talked about this last week where we had a capital letter and a lowercase letter. Here, the K refers to the geologic period, Cretaceous. And the lowercase e refers to the Utah Formation, which is a type of sand layer. The KT, in this case, means the Cretaceous Tuscaloosa Gravel Formation. Okay. Next up, if you go west, we have another Cretaceous boundary or region. This is the Cretaceous Coffee Formation and the Cretaceous Stardust Formation. All right. Then we have another layer of Cretaceous, so the Cretaceous Demopolis Formation, the Cretaceous Coon Creek Formation. And then one more, the Cretaceous McNary and the Cretaceous Owl Creek. Again, just reviewing this, you do not need to know these in terms of the specific names. Main thing I want you to understand, though, is that from Patontock Ridge, this line east to the Transition Hills, these are all sediments of Cretaceous age. Now, why does that matter? Well, for example, if you're looking for dinosaur fossils, you're a paleontologist, the only place in Tennessee where you have any chance whatsoever of finding dinosaur fossils is in the rocks of the age when dinosaurs lived. And recall then, dinosaurs lived over a long period of time throughout the Mesozoic era, spanning the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods. We don't have any Triassic rock, and we don't have any Jurassic rock because those have all been washed away. The only rock that we have left of that Mesozoic era is the Cretaceous. And the only place where we have Cretaceous rocks that are part of Tennessee anymore is in this region right here, this little triangle from Patontock Ridge up and over to the Transition Hills. So in all of Tennessee's history, there's only been a single bone of dinosaur that's ever been found in the state. And it's a hadrosaur dinosaur, a type of duckbill dinosaur that was discovered in Decatur County, right around in here. So if you go anywhere east of that, or if you go west of that, you're not going to be in the appropriate age rocks to have dinosaurs. If you go east into Middle Tennessee, where all this blue is, well, the rocks are way too old. Those rocks were laid down, couple 100 million years before dinosaurs even evolved. So you never would expect dinosaur fossils to be there. And furthermore, those rocks are primarily of marine origin. So they're limestones formed in oceans. If you go west of Patontock Ridge, then you're too young for the Cretaceous period. And therefore you've missed dinosaurs completely because dinosaurs had already gone extinct. So that's where you would expect mammalian fossils, particularly if it's terrestrial deposits. So you might find, you might get lucky and find a mammoth or a mastodon fossil, for example, or a bison, but you would never expect to find dinosaurs, only in that one particular zone. Any questions about that? Okay. All right, proceeding west then, notice here that the abbreviation then goes to T. And the letter T here, for this Flatwoods ecoregion, we're looking at T and lowercase m. The T here is the old name for the period we call the Tertiary, which basically is sort of an outdated geologic period. Probably more than 10 years ago, we used to call everything from the Paleocene to the Pliocene was referred to as one gigantic period called the Tertiary. And then in more recent times, maybe say in the last 10 years, we've split that into two periods, the Paleogene and the Neogene. And so this is just a sort of an old term here that reflects an old pattern there. The lowercase m refers to the Midway group, which is all these rocks, by the way. Who can tell me? Let me ask someone here. Juliet, what is the geologic epoch that would be at about 62 million years ago?
Paleocene.
Say it one more time.
Paleocene period.
You're great. Absolutely, Juliet. Yeah, the Paleocene. Very good job. So when you get slightly younger than the Cretaceous, younger than 65.5 million years, you have entered the Paleocene. Very good. And we're going to stay in the Paleocene just a bit. And now I want you to keep watching, because what we're doing is we're going from older sediments over on the eastern side near the Tennessee River. Here's the Tennessee River again, just in case you're wanting some context. So you're in Cretaceous sediments here at 65, 70, 80, 90 million years. And now we've entered the Paleocene here, where these sediments are at about 60 or so million years old. And now what we're going to do is, if you keep going west, you still have tertiary sediments. And these tend to be more of the age of about the Eocene, so roughly 55 million years ago. We're progressively getting younger as we go west. All right, and then finally, three things for this map is you'll see the capital Q here, which means Quaternary period. That's the period that we are currently in, and that started about 2.5 or so million years ago to the present. And then the lowercase l here refers to, there's three types of Quaternary loess deposits. There's the wind-blown loess that has, there's three types of Quaternary age deposits in West Tennessee. There are those that are loess, which is the wind-blown rock flour. Remember we talked about the glaciers pulverizing the rock and the winds blowing that wind-blown sediment. Well, that's what you see that forms a blanket over all of Western Tennessee here and Western Kentucky and Mississippi. So this area that's kind of this pale beige, kind of yellowish color, that's all wind-blown loess. And then we have what's called Quaternary aged alluvium. These are mostly silts and sand that has been deposited within the last 2 million years by rivers specifically. So this zone that I'm showing here refers specifically to the floodplain of the Mississippi River, as well as the major river floodplains that extend across the coastal plain, okay? There's also some Quaternary alluvium over here back in Middle Tennessee. Notice around Clarksville, See up here on the Cumberland River, how yellow that is? That's because those were all sediments laid down within the past, several 100,000 years or maybe past 2 million years. All right, then finally, there's another category called quaternary high-level alluvial terraces. What that means is these are the stranded sediments from when rivers once flowed at a much higher level. Okay, they're on they today are up on a terrace, an elevated point above a river. And so, for example, these are not sediments that are part of any active floodplain, but they're elevated up, in some cases, 50 to 300 feet or even higher above an active river. And those represent very ancient river deposits from when the rivers flowed at a higher, were flowing across the land at a higher level. It doesn't mean that river was 200 feet deep. What that means is that river, instead of flowing today in a valley here, that means that, say, 3 million years ago or 2.5 million years ago, it was flowing along where a ridgetop is today. And that in that past 2 million years, that river has actually cut down from its original position into a floodplain or into a valley. So those can be very informative when you have those high-level alluvial terraces, because it tells you where rivers used to be, and oftentimes at a very different level. We'll come back to that. It may be a bit confusing, but we'll come back on that. All right, now let's zoom in on this geologic map. So I'm going to click a link here. And I've got these links in places. We're going to zoom in here. And what I want to do is kind of just get using the geologic maps occasionally. We're going to zoom in on this part of West Tennessee. And we did this the other day. Sorry for that. We did this the other day. And what I'm particularly interested in here is that you can, understand that, you want to look for the code, the capital letter and the lowercase letter. And in this case, we're looking for KT here, right? K stands for Cretaceous. T in this case stands for Tuscaloosa Formation. You wouldn't know that, but because you have this geologic map, you can actually go and look that up. Over here, notice that it says KE, that's Cretaceous Utah Formation. So what we want to do then is go down and look at this legend. And the legend here, it's got some important bits to it that we need to understand. Number one, because this is a map for the entire state, there are geologic maps for a particular county or a section of a county, what's called a quadrangle. That's like a rectangular area of a particular county. Here, we're looking at a statewide geologic map. And so this legend is going to sort of have, it's going to have these smaller inset maps here, which can be quite helpful. And what we can do then is sort of look, and it says Gulf Coastal Plain, and then you can look at the various layers, like here's Quaternary layer, Quaternary, Tertiary, and Cretaceous. And then it's got the color coding here. It shows you what you're looking at. And here's the two in particular, the KT, Tuscaloosa Formation. That's the oldest of the Cretaceous. And it shows you a little description of that. It's a poorly sorted, light gray, chert gravel in a matrix of silt and sand, locally interbedded with sand and clay lenses. The thickness is up to 0 to 140 feet. Thinking back to soils, if you are interested in the region and you're looking for, you want to know something about the soils, remember the soils are derived from the parent material. They're derived from the bedrock. In this case, the parent material for that part of Tennessee is the Tuscaloosa Formation, right? And there's the one for Utah Formation. Let's just read it real quick. Grayish green, sand, fine-grained, glauconitic. That's a particular type of mineral. Micaceous, interbedded with gray laminated clays, which commonly contain carbonized or silicified wood. Basically, what that means is there's fossilized wood in that layer. And because that's from the Cretaceous, that means those wood fragments are 65 million years old or older. That's tropical wood. Those genera of plants don't even grow here anymore. Most of those most of those plants that are represented by wood fragments here, today their nearest relatives are in Indonesia and Malaysia. So silicified wood, and it shows that the thickness is up to 180 feet and it thins northward. So knowing how to read geologic maps is a skill that you all definitely need to make sure that you are at least familiar with. And just again, you can look at this for the entire state. It's quite complicated, but it's not very complicated actually, but you know, there's just a lot of information here that you may not get much from a biology class, but it's definitely relevant. So I encourage you to explore this and zoom in. I'm going to have something on the exam, and I'm trying to figure out a way to make you know, some type of a system to where, you know, you can maybe an exercise or something you can go to and use these maps to get some experience. So I'm still thinking through that. I might actually save that for the class project that we talked about. Okay, next up, let's get out of there then. And let me know if you have any questions about that. Otherwise, we will proceed. Okay, so let's start with the transition hills. This is a region that is a very hilly, very dissected region. It's probably the most dissected region within the coastal plain of Tennessee. This is a three-dimensional sort of block diagram that kind of shows where it is in relation to like central Tennessee and kind of a little bit about how it formed. What I want to call your attention to is sort of this area right in here. At the end of the Paleozoic era, so roughly, what would that be? Probably 400 million years ago or so, this kind of shows what the area that is today's Tennessee would have looked like in terms of a three-dimensional diagram. What I want you to notice is that the region underneath the Nashville Basin, which we said was a dome, remember, a geologic dome. And the way that happens is when you have some type of force which pushes the rocks up and causes a layer that is flat-lying to become arched upward. Now take a look at this. Here you've got these what were flat-lying layers that all of a sudden gets pushed up, and that pushes the land surface up above it, creating this arch or this dome. We said then that has a way of fracturing rocks. It can create fault lines. It exposes softer, more erosion-prone rock, which then means that rivers can cut down. They can begin to form valleys. They can cut and begin to erode away basins. Through you know, both through the mechanical process of removing sediments, but also through acids and rainwater, especially can dissolve limestone. Now, at the same time that uplift is occurring, I want you to take a look at what's happening over here. As we'll see in the next couple of weeks, we had a rift valley off to immediately to the left where about Memphis is. That rift valley is where the Earth's tectonic plates were pulling apart. And so with the dome pushing up and with the rift valley pulling apart, literally trying to split North America at the seams. That meant then that those flat-lying sediments over here began to sink down and become depressed over or underneath what is now Memphis. That depression of the land, which we call subsidence, happened at a time when later on it would allow the ocean, the Gulf of Mexico, and actually the ocean that is to come all the way through the center part of the United States. What we call that is an intercontinental seaway. So all of central North America was essentially covered in the ocean. That split off the eastern United States from the Rocky Mountains by a fairly wide sea. Here you can see by the time we get into the Mesozoic era that we have expanded pretty far into this region. In fact, it was covering what is now western Tennessee. The inner coastline got as far as about 30 miles west of Clarksville. That's how far the inner edge of this coastline came. So we begin to see some of those deposits like the Cretaceous Utah Formation and the Cretaceous Tuscaloosa gravels begin to be laid down at that time. That's how they sort of originated. That was their depositional environment. And then proceeding through time, that coastline gradually begins to retreat down south to the modern day Gulf of Mexico, and it leaves those sands and gravels behind. And then rivers were in different places. We had different streams and different rivers, sometimes at higher positions, flowing across the land. They were dropping additional quaternary aged high-level terrace sediments. And then we come finally to the modern period where rivers have then cut down even farther and deposit additional quaternary alluvial deposits along streams. So this sequence of diagrams here is just aimed to show you kind of that progression of change in this region, but it accounts for why we have those Cretaceous gravels. In this case, the orange or the green sediments rather, and notice that they lie over the top of the sort of the blue and the purple sediments. All right, let's move forward and show this in another way. So here we have a landslide along the Tennessee River in Hardin County, Tennessee, down near Pickwick Dam State Park. And several houses here actually washed off of the bluff and collapsed. This is several years ago. What I want to call your attention to is that layer right there. If you look below that yellow line, you can actually see the outcroppings of limestone here, right? You can see those sort of horizontal ledges from the rock outcrops, the bedrock limestone. But then notice above upslope how bright orange and sandy and brown those soils are. Those are the layers of sand that is all of Cretaceous age. And here you can see then, so you have Cretaceous sand directly over top of Mississippian limestone. Look at this another way down here. There's that layer. This is a completely different site, but you can see that layer of limestone. And then again, Cretaceous sand is on top of the Mississippian limestone. Now, obviously here you have a landslide, you know, it's like almost like an avalanche. So those sediments have shifted because they've been washing down slope. But this is a really clear point where you can see the contact in between those. Keep in mind that the Mississippian aged rocks are the Paleozoic era. So they're roughly 320 million years old. The Cretaceous age sands here are like, 90 to 70 million years old. So what does this line represent when you have two starkly different ages with a lot of missing rock in between? What's that called?
Is it a nonconformity or unconformity, I think?
Yeah, unconformity. That's it. Unconformity. Good job, Brandon. All right. Here's another way to visualize this. This is generally what the Transition Hills ecoregion looks like around Pickwick Lake. You can see it's a hilly sort of up and down region. It's almost entirely forested. And then if you look at this in three-dimensional cross-section view, you can see the pink here, the Decatur limestone, for example. You've got the Lobelville Formation. These are all the Mississippian age limestones down here. And then notice then your Utah Sand Formation up on top of that. So that just shows you that you've got these very young sands directly overlying the Mississippian rocks. Some important areas, natural areas in this region include Tishomingo State Park. Lots of forest here, both dry as well as mesic. Remember that I'm slowly introducing you guys to some of these ecosystem terms as we go through these ecoregions. I want you to get a glimpse as to what different habitat types look like. Dry forest obviously makes a lot of sense. It is what it is. Mesic is a term that I've used once or twice, and it basically refers to moist. So when we have moist forest, typically down in protected stream valleys or in ravines or on north-facing slopes. A lot of the uplands of the transition hills historically look like this. Now, this photo is not from there. This is actually from East Texas. But they would have historically been an extensive area of shortleaf pine, post oak and blackjack oak and hickories, and a variety of other species like sourwood. And this was a fire maintained landscape. Once we took fire off of the landscape, unfortunately, these open savannas and woodlands began to succeed into closed canopy forest because a lot of other trees began to pop up in the in-between and grew up in between these pines. Those hardwood trees, which have broad leaves, dropped their leaves and began to form a blanket of leaf litter on the ground. All the grasses on the ground began to disappear. And gradually that environment became more and more moist and more shady. That process of becoming shadier and moister is a term known as mesification. It's a really important phenomenon that's happening in many places across the eastern U.S. right now. And it is completely transforming ecosystems that were historically these open ecosystems into unnatural, artificially forested ecosystems. Here's a good photograph of that. This shows an open pine woodland on the right. This is in Arkansas. And here you can see it's a pine with a lot of native grasses on the ground, very open. You can tell from the blackened trunks that these are a fire-maintained landscape where fire burns through frequently. If you take fire off the landscape, then it's going to become like the scene on the left. Extremely dense. And this is typical of a lot of Tennessee in the Mid-South right now. Some of these landscapes on the left are also extremely problematic from like a fire perspective. These whole forests can be devastated if fire gets through it when it's that dense. But if fire were to move through the landscape on the right, it just burns the grass and it stays down on the ground without climbing up into the canopy and killing all the trees. Laura?
Is these two pictures, is that a before and after? Is that the same?
No, I don't think it's the exact same site. It's the same general region. And I just stole these off the internet to prove my point. But sadly, I can't give you photographs from this exact region that show the before and after, because so many of the areas of the transition hills today look like this.
Ugh.
Don't know intact examples that look like the scene on the right anymore. It's a huge conservation issue currently. Some other places down here, this region has been impacted by impoundments. So the construction of Pickwick Dam by the Tennessee Valley Authority, of course, backed up parts of the Tennessee River and flooded a lot of the lower elevations of the transition hills. Historically, much of the Tennessee River Valley in this region was a swampy sort of floodplain, and it had extensive marshlands, cypress swamps. Most of these have been obliterated and are currently underneath these artificial lakes like Kentucky Lake and Pickwick Lake. One place where you can still see some of this is called Walker Branch State Natural Area near Savannah, Tennessee in Hardin County. And they still have some, wet meadows and those kind of things. The streams in the transition hills are absolutely lovely. I've canoed one of these called Indian Creek near Waynesboro in Wayne County, Tennessee, about 15 years ago. Streams are just gorgeous. Some of the clearest ones you can imagine, great fishing. I mean, even this picture here looks like the stream is like, a foot deep, but out there, 30 feet out, that could easily be 5 feet deep. The water is very deceptive. A lot of these streams are very crystal clear, even in 7 feet of water. This area is remarkably diverse in dragonflies and damselflies. For example, Walker Branch, there's been 47 species found at this one small state natural area that they inhabit these various seepage wetlands and very important for that type of animal group. All right, next let's move into the Fall Line Hills ecoregion, and this is a little bit to the west of that. all these areas sort of look the same. They look very similar. Not all of them, but many of these look the same. They're kind of undulating up and down. The differences here really are driven by geology. And so that's why I spent so much time at the beginning, maybe 20 minutes or so, talking about geology, because, you know, you may not be able to perceive that you're in a different ecoregion. You know, I once heard a professor, Dr. Elsie Quarterman, say that it was actually one of her students. Dr. Quarterman was quoted as saying, "You could drop me out of a helicopter anywhere in Tennessee or the Southeast, and I'd be able to tell you exactly where I am to the nearest like 20-mile radius." And I believe that's true. I think I could do the same, and I think several people could, because, you know, you look for clues, you look for the landscape and species that you know, and so forth. But if you know how to look for geology, it even adds even more clues. So in this case, if you drop me in the fall line hills versus dropping me in the transition hills or, you know, Pontotoc Ridge, would I be able to tell the difference? I'm not exactly sure I could, because they're that similar. So notice the up and down here. Again, historically, a fire maintained landscape. Many of the early settlers who came through these regions talked about the openness of the woodlands. And here you could see for hundreds and hundreds of feet through the woods. This is historically an area that was pine dominated, particularly down in Alabama. You had longleaf pine. As you get up into Tennessee, you had a lot of shortleaf pine, some loblolly pine. But these pine areas we've talked about are mostly sites with acidic soil, a lot of gravel, a lot of sand. But you can see the blackened trunks here, which indicate that the pine's moving through. One significant addition, though, and we see the ferns in the foreground. Notice how there's like a swale down in the bottom of this of the hill there. A lot of times that's where you'll have these seepage wetlands that'll pop out. They'll pop out of the side of the hill. There'll be wetlands, and those are really important for contributing microhabitats for amphibians and all kinds of additional species, plus things like ferns and many types of shrubs and plant wildflowers that you would not find up on the drier slopes adjacent to that. So it's really important to be aware that moisture differences are really dramatic in these kinds of landscapes. You can go from wet to dry very quickly. The fall line hills are primarily formed by this Tuscaloosa gravel formation. If you've ever gone to Lowe's or Home Depot and bought some pea gravel, right? It's that small, whitish or tannish rounded gravel. It's water worn. Looks like it's been tumbling in a creek. It's very smooth. Well, that's what we're looking at here. If you go to Land Between the Lakes or parts of western Dixon County, southwest of Clarksville, you'll notice that wherever there's a road cut, like especially near the Tennessee River, wherever there's a cut through the hill, you can actually see that there's a pretty deep layer, sometimes, 50 feet or 100 feet, that are these white, very smooth river gravels. And these are the Tuscaloosa gravels of the Cretaceous age. Notice here, this photograph is from Alabama. There's a shark tooth also in these gravels, hinting at that marine near shore origin for these gravels. Chalk Bluff, sort of misnamed, misnomer. This is actually not chalk at all, but it's sand. This is on the western bank of the Tennessee River, just north of the town of Savannah, Tennessee, in Hardin County. But here you can see the deep sand deposits along the river in these various layers. And if you're looking at the geologic map down here, this is where the Tennessee River flows, this little notch. And then notice that you've got a lot of that sand right in here. Importantly, though, in this particular area along the Tennessee River, some of these sands are of recent origin, so they are of Quaternary age, and some of these sands are of Cretaceous age. Chalk Bluff actually happens to be a site that is an important site for fossil plants in this region. So some of these layers up in this particular bluff actually hold in the layers of sediment, they have fossilized plants, leaves and stems and wood that date to roughly 70 million years ago. They're at the very end, in some cases, maybe up to about 80 or 90, but they're the end of the Cretaceous period. And a lot of those are tropical species. They definitely are key for us to understand what the vegetation was like in Tennessee at the end of the Cretaceous period. It's just a brief reminder about the word cuestas. Okay, so here in West Tennessee, where these coastal plain sediments overlie older Paleozoic rock, if you were to zoom in on that coastal plain section here, if you were to zoom in on this, it's not flat, right? It's sort of these little ridge systems with a valley, with another ridge system in a valley. And that's what we call cuestas. And it's really pronounced in Alabama, down here, and in Mississippi, where you kind of go over a ridge system and then you hit this little valley and a ridge. Up in Tennessee, though, those cuestas become very narrow. Those landforms become very, very narrow. Instead of being, 20 and 30 miles wide, like they are in parts of Alabama, up here they may be 5 miles wide or 10 miles wide, or even up in towards Kentucky, 1 or 2 miles wide. So the distinctions between noticeable. This shows sort of an explanation of the geologic age of the strata. Laura?
I just got lost there for a second. You're not talking about the ridge and valley of East Tennessee.
No, these are just kind of go back to that we talked about, that layered cake.
Yeah.
When in the first couple lectures, where the oldest layers are down here and then you got the younger layers on top. That's
Right.
kind of what we're talking about here. The oldest layer here is the blue, in this
Okay.
case, which is Paleozoic. And progressively, these younger layers are kind of being exposed right on the edge of the cake, all the way down
Okay.
to the Gulf of Mexico here. Yeah.
Thank you.
I like this map because it shows that these cake layers, particularly for the things like the Paleocene and the Eocene, the Oligocene, they're all a lot wider down here in Alabama and Mississippi. But the point I'm trying to make, I guess, before I got lost, is that Tennessee and Kentucky, those layers are really thin. And so not a lot of people in Tennessee have recognized them because they are so skinny up through that region. Okay. So I encourage you to take a look at this. Real quick, just to review, we're going from Paleozoic. Here we go across this region of Cretaceous rock. It goes all the way up into Illinois and all the way down and around. Then we go into, as Juliet said earlier, the Paleocene here in orange. We go into Eocene here in yellow. We stay in the Eocene here in pink, and we stay in the Eocene here in this sort of peach color. And then all this is Quaternary right here in yellow. Okay. Any questions about that? Okay. All right. So let me just do a little check here and see who all's in. All right. Good deal. So next up, let's there's just another way to visualize cuestas. I'm not going to talk about that anymore because I think we've kind of illustrated that point right there. All right, next up then is that the fall line hills, which is what we were talking about, because they are so narrow, less than 10 miles wide in some cases and becoming even narrower to the north, then they kind of run into this other ridge system over here, which is called Patontock Ridge. That's a name that a lot of people in Mississippi know, but it's not widely used here in Tennessee. And it's associated with one of those ridge systems, those cuestas, called the Ripley Cuesta. And if you look here, this Alabama, I'm not sure if it's Mississippi or Alabama, but here you can see the Ripley Cuesta is this light green, sort of lime green ridge system right there. That's the one we're talking about. And then the fall line hills, which we were also discussing, is this sort of blue-green. They're separated generally blacker. What happens in Tennessee? The Black Belt Prairie kind of comes up out of Alabama and it stops. And that's when the fall line hills to the east and the Patontock Ridge on the Ripley Cuesta to the west, they begin. and they're right against each other. And that's when they become somewhat imperceptible. So if you want to know the distinction there, you have to look at geology. You have to understand whether you're, do you have Tuscaloosa gravels at the surface, or then you're in the fall line hills. If you have McNary sand formation, then you're on Patontock Ridge. Okay. All right. Here's a look. We are going to go ahead and do Patontock Ridge because they are so similar, and then I'll come back and talk to you about the Black Belt Prairie in just a minute. Patontock Ridge is here given a placeholder number 65X because it is really not recognized for Tennessee as a distinct region. Usually it's grouped with another one I'm going to tell you about in a minute called the Northern Hilly Coastal Plain. This is an area that is kind of rolling. You can see the generally hilly nature of this. This is a photograph from Big Hill Pond State Park in McNary County. You can see the Big Hill Pond right here, which is how the park gets its name. This area is one of the few places in the coastal plain where we actually get boulders or rocks at the surface. A general feature of the coastal plain is that we don't get a lot of rocks at the surface in Tennessee or like eastern Arkansas. It's such a sandy environment, or with loess or silt or alluvium, that most of the time the rocks are not present at the surface. And by and large, we don't really have a lot of sandstone anywhere, say in almost nowhere in Middle Tennessee except for the Cumberland Plateau. So once you get west of the Cumberland Plateau, there is no more sandstone to be seen all the way out to Memphis, except in these few isolated hilltops in Patontock Ridge. And this is the type of sandstone that sometimes is embedded with hard concretions of iron, and in which case you oftentimes will hear it called ironstone as well. There is a place in West Tennessee, a landmark called Hollow Rock. And Hollow Rock is a giant sandstone boulder in Carroll County. It's a pretty famous landmark. Big Hill Pond State Park, because of the ups and downs, hills and ravines, has a lot of those, moist ravines with beech trees and tulip poplars and white oak trees. And it's also got a lot of ferns, very rich displays of wildflowers. So some really, nice forested ravines in a lot of these places. Sadly, a lot of these have been severely logged and deforested. So what we have left in terms of forest in West Tennessee is really important. We don't have a lot of great intact forest habitat out there yet. Any questions so far? I think my reception may have gone out just a hair. Okay. Now, a lot of these forests are mesophytic, which means they are moist, but some of these forests also can be quite dry, and in which case they probably were more open historically, like we talked about earlier. There would have been an abundance of pine. Now, most of this pine today is different. So they logged out a lot of the original shortleaf pine stands and replaced it with pine plantations. Things like loblolly pine. They planted it too densely. So if you look out here on the other side, you can't even see any light coming through that tree canopy. That's how dense that forest has been planted in loblolly pine. So there's a lot of deforestation, a lot of logging. Timber industry is a big deal in West Tennessee, a lot of pine plantations. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of high quality, intact, good upland, woodland, pine oak habitats anymore. Then at the lowest elevations, down along those ravines, you can get swampy bottomlands. And a lot of times the water will percolate out from the sandy slopes and the gravelly slopes, and you'll get an abundance of what are called seepage swamps. These are really important communities. They are rare ecosystems. They sometimes have rare trees in them, like the Sweet Bay magnolia is only found in this habitat in Tennessee. There's several rare plants like Chelone obliqua, the pink turtlehead, which is found only in these ecosystems. And there's a number of reptiles and amphibians which prefer these areas, and a high number of dragonflies and damselflies and those kind. So these seepage wetlands are really important. They extend, there's also some up in Kentucky, like the Blood River Seeps. As a state, the state of Kentucky has a big interest in protecting these seepage forest communities. A lot of Kentucky rare plants are found in Callaway County in this particular habitat. All right, any questions there before we progress into the Black Belt Prairie ecoregion? Surely somebody's got a question. Let me take a sip, and I'm going to designate someone to ask me a question. Who's going to ask? No pressure. I guess everybody, no one's on here.
Actually, I had a question, Doctor. So I think it was in the Potomac Ridge where there was a sandy type of alluvial plain or alluvial rock there. Is that the right area?
Yeah, Potomac
Yeah,
Ridge.
you
Okay.
said it was also, yeah, you said it was also one like that in Cumberland, but based on the map you showed, it kind of looked like it was just out there in the middle of all this other rock. Do you know what caused that?
Let's see. Was that this
I could have
scene
the
here?
region wrong.
Yeah. Or you,
No, it was like a sandy alluvial rock.
yeah, I'm not sure. Not this one, was it?
No, it wasn't that one.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure what that one would be, Matthew. If it comes to you later, ask me about it. I'm happy to try to talk through that with you.
Okay.
I wish I could remember. I'm sorry. Okay, let's talk about the Black Belt Prairie.
You got another question there.
Yeah, another question. Who we got here? Let's see. James says, I was wondering if you were talking about a plant when you were talking about the pink turtlehead. Yeah, for sure. That's a beautiful plant called Chelone obliqua. I'll put that in here, by the way. Chelone obliqua is called pink turtlehead. It's a rare species for us in Tennessee. Okay, let's go to the Black Belt Prairie ecoregion. This is this yellow area here, and it extends north out of Mississippi and down into Alabama. It runs about 250 to 300 miles from north into the southeast, and is about 30 miles wide at its widest point or so, maybe 30 to 40 miles wide. This area stands out. If you look on the left here is a map that shows cultivated landscape. So basically where there are crop fields. It's a very cultivated region. There's a lot of cotton and soybeans and other kinds of cultivated plants. This area is also calcareous because it's underlain by chalk, which has a high degree of calcium carbonate. And you can see that exposed in a lot of the river bluffs in this region. So here that white chalk formation is very evident. This is Cretaceous aged, and this particular chalk formation is called the Demopolis Formation, named for the city of Demopolis, Alabama. Here you can see there's a lot of red cedar, which is a common tree in the Black Belt. It's actually become quite aggressive. It is a native species, but it can move into the prairie regions. The region gets its name because of the black fertile topsoil, and these are mostly vertisol soils. So they do have a heavy clay component that shrink swell property we talked about when we talked about soils. And some of these are also mollisol soils or prairie soils. Unfortunately, this region experienced very high rates of slavery in pre-Civil War days. Some of the highest population densities of African-American slaves were in the Black Belt. Today, if you watch news channels, especially during election time, the Black Belt is often referred to as the Black Belt for its high African-American density, even on like news channels like CNN and Fox and MSNBC. And there it's meant in a way it's talking about the high African-American population of that region, which tends to vote in a certain way. And I'm gonna highlight an interesting connection that recently was made. And of course, there's no direct correlation here, but the fact that this region, if you look at, say, for example, like voting tendencies in recent elections, you can see like the red areas, and I'm not getting political here, so please don't interpret it this way. But I think it's just the connection to be made between demographics, human demographics, with particular regions that have certain natural resources. And so there, we can directly sort of connect. In this case, you've got areas that are, let's say, high Democratic voting regions in blue. Shown here, like in the blue area of South Alabama, is a very rural region. And this is the Black Belt ecoregion. And you can then look at those sort of high Democrat voting tendencies with looking at population demographics. You can go all the way back, let's say, to 1860. You can see that this region also had some of the highest slave populations at the time of the Civil War. The area still does, and there's a lot of legacies of slavery in this region. A lot of inequities, high poverty rates, and this is correlated also to farm size. So if you look at, for example, the average farm size in 1997, there's a lot of large farms. But in this case, especially with the African-American population, not many of them own those farms. These are largely farms that are owned by the white settlers who came and their descendants who came, and many of whom enslaved these Black people who lived in this region. So there's a long, complex, and toiled and complicated legacy in this region. But then tied to that, the same thing, that one of the reasons why those farms are so large, and this is not reflected here in this graphic, is that those farms were taken directly from Native American populations. The Choctaw and the Chickasaw both were kicked off of their land, leave, forced to leave Oklahoma. And so, part of a natural history course, I think we must confront is the very complex reality of, human effects on the landscape and how those sort of translate to the modern day. And so there's a very complicated human story. We're going to get into that more in probably about 3 or 4 weeks, when we have a whole sort of, probably 3 or 4 lectures on the human history component. But the last thing I want to show then is just, let's take a look at 2 last parts of this graphic. Let's look at where the fertile Blackland prairie soils are. And again, these are specifically the prairie vertisol soils shown in green. And that's the most productive areas for agriculture. Those are the best soils for growing cotton. And then finally, let's take a look at why those soils exist in the first place. Well, it's because that was an ancient coastline during the Cretaceous period that has a high chalk and high calcium concentrations. And so without first having the geology, you would not have that soil type. You would not have those large farms. You would not have probably had the explosion of slavery at the time you did without all that combination of things coming into play. And of course, it doesn't just affect Alabama. We can actually draw similar correlations in other kinds of places across the South. So it's a very, very interesting connection here, how, as the title of this shows, how a coastline 100 million years ago influences modern election results in Alabama. And so there's some really interesting connections here that maybe you hadn't thought about. Now, as this image shows, a lot of the original prairies, which are why we have such black, deep topsoil, a lot of those prairies were plowed in the days before the Civil War and were converted into agricultural fields. And unfortunately, we didn't have good knowledge of how to protect soil health we didn't know really any better to, not try to plant cotton on the side of a hill, or you can't plant cotton every single year. You deplete the soil, you ruin it. And so what happened was that soil became depleted. In many cases, that very rich, fertile black topsoil washed away, leaving exposed this very nutrient poor clay or chalky subsoil behind. And so in the absence of that, this region then, a lot of these areas that were popular for growing cotton, they switched out and began grazing cattle. So a lot of these areas today are actually cattle pastures on what was historically formerly prairie, but it probably went through many rounds of cotton production before becoming cattle pastures. This painting by my friend Philip Juris shows what the historical Black Belt prairie landscape would have looked like. And it was not a continuous prairie, but it was these prairie islands that sort of occupied these tops of hills, separated by patches of woodlands that you see down along the creek valleys and on side slopes. Today, just a few of these prairie remnants exist, places like here and here. This is from Alabama. This is a picture from Mississippi. All right, any questions about the Black Belt Prairie? Like I said, we normally would take a break now. I'm going to go just a few minutes longer, and then we're going to take a break at the top of the hour at 6 o'clock. Okay. All right. Let's talk about the Flatwoods ecoregion. This is an area that in Tennessee is separated from the Black Belt by Patontock Ridge. But if you go south into Mississippi, there are places where Patontock Ridge begins to kind of sliver out. And then you get the Flatwoods directly to the west of, sort of abutting against the Black Belt. So Patontock Ridge, begins to sort of fade out as you go down into Mississippi a little bit. This is an area that, and I can show you what I mean by that right here. If you see Patontock Ridge is this dark green sort of band, notice that about right here, it fades out where you have this river system coming in. And at that point, the Flatwoods touches against the Black Belt. And this is true in a couple more areas southward when you get into Alabama. The Flatwoods extends, it's a very flat region, hence the name Flatwoods, and it is mostly wooded today. According to the earlier EPA ecoregion map, it was only mapped as coming up into one part of southeastern Hardeman County, Tennessee, this area 65B that I'm circling here. But notice the geologic layer actually extends all the way up into westernmost Kentucky, just up to the west of Paducah. So what I have done on our new map here in blue, this blue-green, is to show the broader distribution of the Flatwoods ecoregion. This is generally what we mean by Flatwoods. I've used this image in other places. This is actually a photograph from Missouri, but it's very flat and it accumulates water because there's a clay hardpan underneath it. And so in the spring and the winter, these are hydric, which means they're wet. And then in the summer and the fall, they are very dry, bone dry, and they become xeric, is the term we use, X-E-R-I-C, xeric. And so collectively, we use that combination term, hydroxeric, to refer to these flatwoods. That means that they're winter wet and xeric, they're summer dry. A lot of flatwoods have this grassy floor, and they have scattered trees, primarily oak trees like willow oaks and water oaks, sometimes other species. And you can tell in many cases, if you know what you're looking for, right? If you know how to read these forensic ecology clues, you can tell that there's a fragipan present. Here's some of those clues. Number one, you've got a very flat landscape. Secondly, you have what are called tree tip-up mounds. In this case, there was a tornado that blew through this area, so you would kind of expect some trees to have been blown down, obviously. But notice what happens here. Because the roots are so shallow above that clay hardpan, they can't put roots down very deeply. And so they're kind of forced to, in the upper sort of 30 inches of soil or less. So if you get a windstorm blowing through, then very easily they can topple over. And then when they topple over, if you look here in this hole over here on the left where the root has upturned, it's actually full of water. That's why it's black in there. That's full of water. So there's a high water table at this site, meaning that the water is very close under the surface. And then finally, you can see also this water staining or ponding. And so sometimes in wet seasons, you'll actually have these little vernal pools at the surface where the water is saturating the soil and staining it, or you'll have actually standing water. And these are great habitats for a variety of amphibians. This is just a three-dimensional diagram that shows what we mean by sort of a clay hardpan. These are the soil horizons, and you might have that A horizon, for example. But down here is what we're looking at, all this orange stuff. And that's this very, very dense clay layer that often has sort of these zones of separation here. Well, excuse me, these are not zones of separation. These are the eluviation horizon, which means that it's usually kind of whitish looking. It can even be calcified or with calcium, and it begins to break down in time. And this area would be all very white and leached of nutrients. So it's very nutrient poor. It's often very acidic, and you've got the clay hardpan, which means that roots can't go down very deeply. And then it goes from wet to dry. So you can imagine how harsh it is to grow in fragipan soils with all of those constrictions: shallow soil, acidity, and the water fluctuations. This is what a hardpan looks like in cross-sectional view. So it's not very deep here. This is about, what is that? Probably 2 decimeters or so. Yeah, it's 60 centimeters. Below a depth of 60 centimeters, yeah. Oh, no, this is 60 centimeters right here, yeah. So here's the 1 meter mark right there. That's 1 meter down. You're deep into the fragipan. The fragipan actually begins right here at the 60 centimeter mark right there. And notice those vertical striations of that light colored, highly leached zones. That's just so dense, you can't even hardly dig through it. If you had a shovel or a pickaxe, really to make any kind of progress in trying to dig into a fragipan, you need a backhoe. So what we don't know about the flatwoods is what it was like historically. And part of that, as we'll explore, is that this region was so modified early on by early waves of settlers that we just don't have a clue. We think a lot of these areas were actually prairie or open types of grasslands. It's probable that there was also a lot of flatwoods, as we talked about. And these areas have also long been important to Native American populations. From about the year 1000, from about the year 1000 up to about the year 1400 or so, this region had a very flourishing population of what we call the Mississippian Indians. And this is at Pinson Mounds State Archaeological Park, which has a really large Mississippian era mound. Still, there's a great museum here with lots of great exhibits. I encourage you to visit that place if you get a chance. It's near Jackson, Tennessee, right up in here, just to the southeast of Jackson. All right, let's talk next about the northern hilly coastal plain. Not a lot to say. It's like Patontock Ridge. It's like the Fall Line Hills, but it is worth mentioning here. And I will say that in the original ecoregion classification, the northern hilly coastal plain was combined with Patontock Ridge and the Fall Line Hills, all as one unit. Me suggesting to split these out, largely following what Mississippi and Alabama have done. Does it really make a difference in the end? Probably not. But I mainly did that to just reflect the sort of accuracy of the geology of this region. This area is a Eocene aged region. So these are Eocene formations of the Ripley Formation. Actually, I shouldn't say that. The Ripley is a little bit farther to the east. So these are tertiary Eocene age formations here. This, like those other areas, is mostly hilly, gently undulating, a lot of forest habitat. Chickasaw State Forest is one area where you can go and there's trails and all that kind of stuff. You can get a sense here from the topographic map how dissected this landscape is. Notice a lot of these streams and ravines here. There's a lot of seepage, wetland seeps in these communities that are really important. Further south in Mississippi, this area begins to kind of sort of become more gently rolling. You can see a lot of the pine. It's a pine hardwood region. There's a lot of these pines are planted. That's why they're so densely congested in these sort of clusters. Those are plantations. And then as you roll off to the west, sort of the Mississippi River, this plain begins to sort of level out and then becomes an area that is fairly flat and extensive open plain. We'll call the plain shown here. So we're going to go into a new region now, the Lusk Plain, which makes up a large portion of the coastal plain of Western Tennessee. And this is primarily in the uplands. So the areas that are down along the creeks, which are shown blue, is an area that we refer to as the Lusk Plain meander belts, and we'll talk about those in a minute. So the Lusk Plain opens up. It's a big agricultural region, except for tree lines and fence rows. There are very few trees in this area, at least today. The Lusk Plain gets its name because of the very deep blown lusk deposits. This picture plain shows a 11-meter deposit, very deep wind-blown deposits. A lot of this area is heavily agricultural, a lot of soybeans, a lot of corn, especially those two crops. There's not a lot of public lands in this part of West Tennessee. It's really a primarily private land, a lot of farms. One of the largest farms in the area is called Plantation, east of Memphis. 1,000 farm. A lot of potential for some of these lands to sort of play a very pivotal role in conservation. One thing they do at the Ames farm, for example, the Ames plantation, is focus on trying to manage for certain game species like bobwhite quail. So there's a lot of potential to do grassland restoration in these areas. Before I talk about the Lusk Plain meander belts, I want to bring up one important point, which is the Lusk Plain. As you go farther in the region to the east, over here, the lusk formations are not as deep. They become deeper as you go west toward the Mississippi River, over here toward the Lusk Bluff or the Bluff Hills ecoregion. That might translate into a very real difference on the ground, and here's why. The farther west you Bluff Hills, then we think that area historically was, prior to say 1830, we think that area was mostly densely forested. The areas on the eastern side, so maybe about where the word, the R in Obion River is here, for example, from here down just to where about the Wolf River is, from there east, we think that area was primarily prairie. We'll get into that evidence later. But this is one of those regions where you had prairie on the eastern side, near the northern hilly coastal plain, and it progressively got densely forested as you move west. Now, these the various river systems that cross the Lusk Plain, here shown are those major systems, major rivers: the Obion, the Forked Deer, the Hatchie, the Loosahatchee, and the Wolf River. These rivers really are quite different. And if you look in Arkansas, they separate those same swampy rivers as their own level 4 ecoregion. That's the reason for doing it here. So this includes a number of very important stream systems, like the Hatchie River, for example, which has the Hatchie River National Wildlife Refuge. The Hatchie River is important because it is the longest free-flowing tributary of the lower Mississippi River, and contains an extensive section of forested floodplain that still contains a lot of swamp forest and bottomland hardwood forest. This is a big priority for the Nature Conservancy of Tennessee. They work to try to buy and protect a large chunks of these forested bottoms. And as well as there's a lot of tree planting initiatives in this region to try to reforest those areas that have been logged in the past. As I mentioned, it's the longest free-flowing tributary to the lower Mississippi. It's undammed and it's not channelized. Damming is not really a big issue in these swampy floodplains like it is farther east. You know, we tend to dam up rivers in the mountains for hydropower and clean water and as a drinking water. But these silty and muddy rivers in the coastal plain, the primary threat to them through the years has been channelization of the river, like the straightening of its channel. Let's take a look here. I'm going to ask you guys a couple questions. This is the Hatchie River bottom. What do you notice about this river?
It's very curvy.
It's very curvy. That's one thing. Okay. Anything else? It's primarily forested. Okay. Around the river, that is. The bottomlands are forested swamps. And there's one other thing that I want to show you. This is switching over to a topographic map view. Is that curvy river, we call that sinuous. It's a highly sinuous channel, right? It means it just doubles back on itself and makes a bunch of loops. Sometimes these loops get cut off where the river changes course, and you can have these isolated sections of former river bends that we call oxbow lakes. And notice how many of these oxbows that you see in here, right? Look at there, just a bunch of these abandoned oxbows all up and down the river channel here. So that's a common feature of these swampy river bottoms in the coastal plain. Now, some of these rivers have a really important biodiversity, and then some of them also have some unusual species. We're beginning to see alligators, for example, in the Wolf River in Fayette County, just east of Memphis. They have probably been released here. I'm sure they have, but there are records of alligator along the Mississippi swamplands of, let's say, as far north as the Boot Heel of Missouri. Francis Bailey, an early English explorer, documented alligators in southeast Missouri in the 1790s, about 1795. So alligators almost certainly have historically been present in Western Tennessee. We tend not to recognize them very much these days, but they certainly are in the state now at a limited capacity. This particular section of the Wolf River is often called the Ghost River section. It's not the name of the river, it's just the name of a particular section. It's kind of spooky, it's a little misty and swampy and with filtered light, but it's a pretty cool area. You can actually paddle through large sections of this river. The channelization of these swampy river floodplains has been a massive source of environmental degradation in the coastal plain. Here, for example, you can see the original channel of the river that we talked about. It's very curvy and sinuous. You can see those oxbows there very visibly. A lot of that is swampland. There's marshes. That's all part of that river system. The very natural part of the dynamics of these floodplains is to have swampland and marshland and open water and bottomland hardwood forest. Well, in the days of attempting to improve navigation and flood control and all those factors, because, if you think back in the 1800s and the 1900s, you just couldn't move through these swamplands. They were really like these impenetrable barriers until we had advancements in technology that allowed, for machinery to go into those places and logging to go into those places. They kind of stood as the last sort of frontiers in the South in many cases. And so Unfortunately, though, by the time we get into the 1900s, we were beginning to see the channelization. So they would take heavy mechanized machinery and go down and basically scoop out and dredge out the channel and straighten it. And so you've got the original channel off to one side, but then you've got this long straight channel over here. This is what that looks like. It's a devastating process ecologically. This is happening in this case. There's a photograph in 1917. So it just gives you an idea of how early some of this was taking place. Any
There's a
questions? Yeah, go
yeah.
ahead, Laura. Yeah.
There's a question in the chat.
Question in the chat. Let's take a look. Let's see. Kian says, I think a slough might be more of a wetland than a lake, but I might be wrong. Yeah, so, oh, okay. Kian's answering back up here. We go back. Okay. Phoebe says, what's the difference between an oxbow and a slough? Yeah, so really, it's sort of a gradation, Phoebe. Originally that oxbow, when it initially forms, it looks like the river is there, right? It's got basically a channel in it, but it's just cut off on both ends, isolated from the main river channel. But as you go over time, let's say through the decades or over 100 years or more, that oxbow lake, as it is initially, begins to fill in with sediments. It becomes shallower. You might have beavers in there. And slowly it begins to kind of, maybe it's a marsh, and then it becomes, it can even sort of fill in over time completely. And it sort of goes from an open water lake into like a marsh. And if it fills in to a point, it can actually develop into a swamp. And so that's a little bit of the difference. I think of a slough as, you could use a slough for an oxbow. That's absolutely, I can think of situations where you would do that. Slough is generally just sort of an ambiguous sort of term for a slow moving wetland channel. It's almost like bayou. It can be used in a variety of cases. All right. Let's go now to the Bluff Hills ecoregion. I also call it the Luss Bluff, over here on the far west part. This is where the fairly level to flat plain at the western edge of the Luss Plain begins to drop off very dramatically down into the Mississippi floodplain. So let's take a look. Notice that this ecoregion is a bit discontinuous. So there's a big patch of the Bluff Hills up here, and then it kind of separates and so forth on down. It's not continuous all along, but generally speaking, the Bluff Hills goes from westernmost Kentucky up just to the west of Paducah, all the way down along the eastern side of the Mississippi River, all the way through Mississippi down into Louisiana. And if you're in Louisiana, they call those hills the Tunica Hills. They give them a different common name there. This is what it's like looking back to the east from the Mississippi River floodplain. You can see that line of hills. It's basically an escarpment is what it is. From the Mississippi floodplain in the foreground, you climb up the Bluff Hills onto the Luss Plain of West Tennessee. If you're looking at that in a different way, where I was just showing you, would be like if you were standing here where I'm sort of circling with my cursor, looking toward the bluff line here, you climb up this slope, and then you're looking along the top of the hills, and basically you climb up and you flatten out into this plain over here. So there's a difference of elevation here. If you're on top of the Luss Bluff, you're up at about 270 feet. If you're down at the bottom, you're around 230 feet. So it's not a huge climb, but it's pretty dramatic when you're there next to it. Notice that the Bluff Hills are very dissected, very rugged. This is around Fort Pillow State Historic Area, just north of Memphis. Here you can see that the Mississippi River comes right up against the bluff here. Where the river makes contact with the Bluff Hills, it forms a noticeable bluff right along the river's edge. And these were important navigational milestones or landmarks for people who were on the river for centuries. When they found those bluffs, they were very recognizable features. So these bluffs here in West Tennessee that make contact with the Mississippi River, that come up against it, have all been named very, straightforward names like Chickasaw Bluff #1, Chickasaw Bluff #2, Chickasaw Bluff #3, Chickasaw Bluff #4. Those bluffs are all very important, and this is just one example of them.
I got a question on those.
Yeah.
Thanks. Do the bluffs exist because they were closer to the glacial maximum and the lush just had a bigger buildup there? Or is there a harder feature underlying?
Yeah, so the bluffs exist because they were blown from sediments that were picked up and carried across the Great Plains at the
Oh.
edge of the retreating glaciers, probably up in like southern Canada, maybe like Wisconsin, North Dakota, Montana. And then when those glaciers retreated, those sediments were picked up and blown across the Midwest. And then whenever they encountered a river, like the Mississippi River or the Missouri River, then they would tend to pile up. Remember how we talked about snow drifts piling up, right? They'd pile up when you had maybe like a bank or something. And so a lot of these drifts of loess began to drift. And then now they form a deposit that's like 100 feet deep on the eastern bank of the Mississippi, all up and down the Mississippi.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And then so here, the Mississippi River is cutting into one of those bluffs, and it's forming a river bluff that's evident. And so here you can see that. This is the Mississippi River looking into one of those bluffs. And what happens is the river, when it floods, right, it just sort of eats that away. And those bluff sediments are naturally just collapsing and eroding down into the river. So it's a very unstable slope. Loess is extremely powdery. It's like flour. And so these make the bluff hills very susceptible to erosion. That's part of the reason why, if you look here, it's such a topographically dissected with very deep ravines, very deep gullies. If you've ever been in this region, a lot of the creek gullies are like 20 feet deep, and because it's extremely susceptible to erosion. The natural vegetation here is primarily forest. Forest is much better at preserving the integrity of these slopes. And so a lot of these areas are very densely forested. Now, you might imagine that these bluff tops would be naturally good places for defense or for maybe building a fort, or a city. And so, as we'll talk about that in a minute, here's an example of those forests. I mean, when you're in these forests of the Bluff Hills, some of them are really impressive. It's like being in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Very large trees, very rich, lush vegetation. This is Meeman Shelby State Park and State Forest, just north of Memphis. Originally, Interstate 40 was going to go through this forest, but they saved it and actually determined to make it go through the city of Memphis instead. So this is a very large, multi-thousand acre state park. It's one of the prettiest, I think, in our state park system. All right. There's also, here's another scene from the winter. When we talk about forest types, I'm going to spend some more time talking about the Loess Bluff region. One thing I just want to mention quickly is that compared to the other forests of Western Tennessee, which tend to be really acidic and are developed over sand or gravel formations, these are developed over loess, and loess tends to have a lot of calcium in it. And so that means that these forests, while there is no limestone at the surface or anywhere near the surface for that matter, they are limey soils. They do have they have calcium deposits in them, which means that they can support tree species that ordinarily would thrive over limestone, even though the limestone here is very deep underground. Now, I mentioned the fact that you've got those bluffs above the river are good for, defensive positions. So, for example, during the Civil War, you had Fort Pillow, which was a Civil War fort. And here you can see they've sculpted to make these earthen embankments. They would have cannons positioned behind these. ready to shoot down upon a river that was on the Mississippi River, onto a boat floating on the Mississippi River. So this is one of the ways that some of the armies during the Civil War were able to sort of control navigation. The city of Memphis is actually built on Chickasaw Bluff number 4. And so Fort Pillow's on number 1, and there's number 2, number 3, and Memphis is on bluff number 4. You can see it over there on the left. And this has been an important site for defensive fortresses for a long time. The very first Native Americans lived on the fort, on the bluff, which is now Memphis, for thousands of years. There was the area was considered to be within the home range, the ancestral homelands of the Chickasaw Nation, of the Arkansas tribe, and of the Quapaw. So it's not immediately clear exactly which it falls in. A lot of times I see it mapped as part of the Quapaw Nation. Quapaw was primarily a tribe found on the west side of the Mississippi. When this region was first explored by white explorers, the very first explorer to come through this region, he didn't come to Memphis, but he came just a little bit farther south of there, was Hernando de Soto in 1541. In fact, he died soon after crossing the river. He died somewhere in eastern Arkansas. And then the members of his army ended up bringing his dead body back to the Mississippi River, loading it on a raft, and burying him basically at sea, or burying him on the river. So De Soto's body is somewhere probably carried out into the Gulf of Mexico. It was a long time, though, between 1541, the very next white settlers to visit were the French, who came in 1682. We'll talk more about this in about a month. They came in 1682 and built a fort called Fort Prodrome on the bluff here. In 1709, France built another bluff called Fort Assumption. And then the Spanish controlled this part of Tennessee in the 1790s, and they built Fort San Fernando. Shortly thereafter, it was completely within the control of the British. And so it's got a pretty interesting history here. We'll talk a lot about that as we get into the human history part of this class. Here's a picture of De Soto, 1541. He just had no idea he was going to die. And De Soto was not a good person, and he wreaked havoc on Native American populations across the South. This is an interesting map that still survives. This is the original 1743 French map, shows the location of Fort Assumption, now Memphis, and some other features which are shown on many early maps of this period include the river Margot, which is the name that I think was applied to either the Wolf River or the Loosahachie River. It's called the Margot River. And if you look on a lot of the early French maps, you'll see that. Chucalissa Indian Village is located in the southern area of Memphis near the Mississippi state line. This is a Native American village that is reconstructed. I've not been there personally myself. I'd love to go and visit this place. I think it dates to the Mississippian era, which we'll talk about later in class. All right, we're going to go about 10 more minutes, and I'm going to see if there's any quick questions. Maybe go 10, 20 minutes at the most. Let's talk about the Mississippi alluvial plain next. Let me check my slide count here. This is a robust PowerPoint. We are pretty robust here. I've got about 36 slides left to go for the Mississippi alluvial plain. It'd be real nice if I could get through it all. All right, Mississippi alluvial plain. This is a big region that extends along both sides of the Mississippi River. There's a lot more land on to the west of the river. It goes from southeast Missouri, southwesternmost Illinois, through western parts of Kentucky, just a little sliver of western Kentucky and Tennessee, and then goes all the way down to the mouth of the Mississippi River and part of the Mississippi River Delta here. These are the lowest elevations in Tennessee, around 200 feet. or so elevation is the river level at Memphis. This particular alluvial plain stretch for the part that includes West Tennessee, we divide up into several level 4 ecoregions, and some of these are quite obscure. So we're going to have what's called the Northern Holocene Meander Belt, and these other ones here, which we'll get into in a little bit. The ones that are not underlined, such as the St. Francis Lowlands and the Grand Prairie and Crowley's Ridge down here, you see, these are found over in Arkansas, and we won't really be getting into those. So there are four primary, three ecoregions that you need to know for the Mississippi alluvial plain. The first one is the Northern Holocene Meander Belts. This is a pretty cool area. What this shows is the map on the left shows the historic location of rivers flowing through this area. Actually, I don't want to get too deep into that because we'll come back and talk about that later. But suffice it to say that the current Mississippi River that you see from Cairo, Illinois, down to down here to where the Arkansas River enters the Mississippi, during the Ice Age, that was not the Mississippi River. Okay, that was the Ohio River. So the Ohio used to come out and flow down here, and the Mississippi during the Ice Age actually flowed west over on this side and around where the Black River and the Cache River in eastern Arkansas currently are, and the White River, and then entered in down here farther down below Memphis. So it's only in recent times, like the past 10,000 years, that the Mississippi River has actually flowed where it is today. Now, in that 10,000 years, the river has not stayed put. It has meandered its way all down through, and these meanders have been mapped. And so here's a great map on the right, and you can see all the times and places where every time that river would flood and change position, and it would blow out its banks and form new loops, that it basically formed a new channel. In fact, some people are oftentimes shocked to find out that the original border between Arkansas and Tennessee that they mapped in the earliest 1800s doesn't really make sense today, because we actually have a little bit of Tennessee that is on the west side of the Mississippi River, and we have a little bit of Arkansas that's on the east side of the Mississippi River. And that's because the river has changed course through time. But these meander belts are shown here. They've been mapped, they've been aged. You can age these with radiocarbon dating, and so they can get very precise ages on these old meanders. Now, this is the schematic which just kind of shows the general nature of how that happens. And so you can see these old meander scars, which is what we're talking about there. And here's the current river. And so sometimes if you have an oxbow here, that river, when it floods, can just blow through the neck and isolate that oxbow, as has happened here, and it can actually just redirect itself and flow right through the middle of this. There's a lot of dynamics happening in these floodplains. A lot of the Mississippi or the Northern Holocene Meander Belt is historically thought to have been a swamp or a bottomland hardwood forest region. These are basically forests that are wet, either for a few weeks out of the year, or they are perpetually wet, but they are both classified as wetlands. You can see these trees often have flared bases, and those bases help the tree to remain upright in saturated, waterlogged soil. That's called buttressed tree trunks. This is the primary habitat for the now extinct ivory-billed woodpecker. Thrived in these forests up until the early 1900s. This is the historic range of the ivory-billed woodpecker, and you can see that it comes right up into parts of western Tennessee. There. From the air, these bottomland hardwood forests once would have been extensive. They would have covered almost the entire floodplain. Sadly, though, from the 1880s through the early 1900s, these have been just devastated by logging. I mean, just complete loss of bottomland hardwood forest in some locations. They had some technological advances with being able to move trains into these locations eventually, with being able to build certain types of logging equipment that was able to go through muddy, waterlogged soil. There was a huge economic boom around the timber industry. Cities like Memphis became one of the major markets for timber production in the 1900s, and all kinds of wood products were generated out of these, just dozens and dozens of timber companies and sawmills. And they basically went down and just completely deforested the entire lower Mississippi River Valley in just a few decades. After those forests were cut in the meander belt, a lot of those areas were drained by channelization and digging those canals and ditches. And then those areas weren't waterlogged anymore. There was also levee systems. I didn't put this into the slide, but there were also these levees that were built, these earthen dams, to prevent the Mississippi River from flowing across all this valuable land. So when you have a levee system that keeps the land from flooding, you have ditched and drained the swamps that exist, and you've logged all the forest, then what do you do with it? Well, of course, you grow cotton on it. And in these days, this was in the days after slavery had ended, you farm it out to sharecroppers. Many of these sharecroppers were African-American families. There were lots of also white families that were sharecroppers in these regions as well. But they were working for very wealthy, large landowners, some of whom owned tens of thousands of acres of bottomland habitat. This image, I think, says it all. The opulence of this house in Mississippi, surrounded by an area that was once extensive forest, that's now extensive cotton fields, and yet this house is sitting on an Indian mound, on a Native American burial mound or temple mound. So just the audacity of us experiencing this as a nation, devastating the ecosystem, nothing left. Almost no bottomland forest left. We drove the ivory-bill woodpecker to extinction, and yet we are totally disrespectful of the Native American history and presence. We kick out the Native Americans in this region, and we build our homes on their sacred mounds. It's highly disturbing, to be honest with you. Now, in the Holocene meander belt region, where you have a lot of these rivers changing course every year, some of them are depositing silts and sands and stuff. You can have extensive sandbars. A lot of the sand, as I told you about 4 lectures ago, some of the sand is coming from a long ways away. It may be coming from the Appalachians. It may be coming from parts of Minnesota, ultimately. It may be coming from the Rocky Mountains. And it's traveling for hundreds and hundreds of miles. And then it's being carried in the river and deposited and dropped. These sediments are being dropped into these piles that form sandbars. These are really neat habitats. They're mostly weedy, developed, inhabited by a lot of weedy native species and some non-natives. But, there's rare tiger beetles out in some of these sandbars. There's a few rare plants. So they are, important habitats. There's a rare bird, a type of tern, that lives in some of these sandbars. This is an infrared color image that shows some of these sandbars, and you can see these distinctive striations or lines where here's the pure sand, here's sort of these like sand ridges where it's kind of high and dry, almost like coastal beach dunes in a way. And then behind those sand ridges, you see a sand swale where it's wet and you can actually get some low marsh vegetation in there. And progressively, it transitions back in here to sandy woodlands. All that is subject to change, though, if the river floods and gets out of its banks and completely blows out that current river channel. And what you see is the typical condition here is that these rivers are fairly low energy. That's why they sinew their way back and forth, kind of meandering. But it wasn't always the case. At one point in time during the Ice Age, these rivers were high energy. They had very rapid flows of high volume flows, and that river was very wide and quite deep in some cases. And it had a lot of gravel and rock and cobblestones that were being, carried down river. And so we'll talk about that a little bit. Perfect. Okay. Now, so last class period, if you recall, we were finishing up the ecoregions of the Mid-South, okay? We had gotten all the way to the Mississippi River in the river bottoms, and we were talking about some of the regions there. I'm going to skip ahead to this slide just for a minute. We're in this last grouping here, the Mississippi Alluvial Plain, and we had introduced before that the Lusk Plains and the Bluff Hills. We already went through those last period. And now we're going to talk about our what's called the Northern Holocene Meander Belt, which I've already actually gone through. And we had just two more to do, the Northern Pleistocene Valley Trains and the Northern Back Swamps. And then we'll be completely through and end with part one, and we'll be ready to begin part two of class. Before I go into that, let's just really refresh basically on what we mean by Northern Holocene Meander Belts. Jacob, what does a meander belt mean to you? You remember? Let me start with another question. Brandon, what is the Holocene?
Period of geologic time.
Period of geologic time. That's a start. It is recent. Matthew, you looking like you're ready to answer. No. Juliet, you remember the Holocene? Exactly. Very good. 11,700 years ago until today. We're in the Holocene right now. Now, we had talked about another word, the Anthropocene. That one is not, I don't know that it's necessarily formalized, but we technically are still in the Holocene. Now, that's part of the name of this region, right? Holocene meander belts. There's also the word northern in there. So what that means is compared to the meander belts farther south, like in Louisiana, southern Mississippi, those are the southern Holocene meander belts. So these are the northern ones. But now we get to what is a meander belt. Clayton, you remember?
So, meander makes you think of stream structure. So,
Okay.
Slow moving, wandering body of water from out.
Mm-hmm.
So, meander belt area.
Exactly. And so for those of you online, Clayton said basically a meander belt is where you have slow moving, meandering rivers and streams that are kind of going back and forth, right? Very slow, sluggish waters, creating oxbow lakes. It's part of that whole floodplain environment we talked about. And I'm going to show you just a quick graphic. Remember this image here? And you can see where that river, as it moves and it changes position, it creates these oxbow lakes, right? Well, recall from last week's discussion that these can be mapped. You can age those river channels based on the sediments get laid down. You can actually identify when and where that river was. So this is a map that's been done for many decades now that shows those old ancient river corridors, right? You can follow, it's color coded here, but you could follow one particular color, and there's an age you can put to that. Maybe it's 25,000 years ago that particular river was in that position. But the point here is that look at what it's doing. This one river, it's not 10, it's one. This one river is shape shifting, right? It's moving within a certain valley, and sometimes it moves over here 10 miles or 1 mile to the west. And it's often not the entire river, it's certain portions of the river, like its existing channel or this bend, right? And so it's fluctuating, meandering within that broad valley. And as it does that, that whole wide valley then is called a meander belt, okay? It doesn't have the potential to go too much farther this way because there's uplands over here that they can't cut through. And it can't go any farther this way because there's a bluff right there, right? So a meander belt is just that. It's a stream in a valley or in a floodplain where the river cuts and moves back and forth. And the central point I want you to think about, and Clayton said it, is that river really is a sluggish, slow moving stream, right? It's oftentimes kind of swampy, those kind of things, right? So let's visualize what we mean by that in terms of the energy flows of these rivers. Here's what we have on the right with one of these sluggish, slow-moving streams that we see during the Holocene this last 11,000 years. But it wasn't that way. During the Ice Age, particularly at times when the glaciers were fairly far down in North America, you had a lot of meltwater that was coming off of those glaciers. That glacial meltwater resulted in the Mississippi River being enormous, maybe 5 or 10 times bigger than it is today. Think about that. How many of you have driven across the Mississippi River somewhere? It's a big, wide river. It's probably a mile wide or more. But imagine if it was 5 times that big or 3 times that size. Imagine the barrier that it would cause for migrating animals like bison, or other species. Imagine the physical barrier it would be to people, Native Americans trying to come across into the Southeast during the height of certain glacial periods. It would be very difficult to get across that river. Now, not only is it wider, but at its head are glaciers that are calving off icebergs, right? And so it's cold. And then as that glacial meltwater, particularly in times when the glaciers are melting, when the temperatures are going up, that glacial flow, that glacial meltwater is coming down the Mississippi River, both in terms of a lot of volume, a lot more depth, so it makes the river bigger and stronger, harder to get across. What other kinds of things might be in that river? What else? What might be in a fast-moving, cold, heavily flowing stream as opposed to the slow-moving, sluggish river? What kind of sediments would you expect to be in the slow-moving, sluggish river?
Fine sediments.
Silts and clay, those smallest particles, maybe a little bit of sand as well. But you wouldn't expect gravel to be in this slow-moving river, right? Not carrying actively in the river, or boulders or cobblestones, right? Or how about big, heavy logs? Maybe, but they're just kind of getting caught up in that slow water. But in a fast-moving river, you got trees coming down river, you got cobblestones coming down, gravel flows and sand. There's a lot of flow coming down. That's what a high-energy river system of the Ice Age is looking like. It's wide and it's braided. It's got gravel deposits and gravel bars and cobblestones, all kinds of stuff. So the the Northern Holocene meander belts then is that part of the Mississippi alluvial plain that is the result of when the river was sluggish and kind of just meandering lazily across the valley bottom. This other region I'm about to show you, though, is the result of when it was a forceful river that was a result of glacial meltwater, because that changed the whole valley bottom. In those places where you have those kinds of deposits, we call that the Pleistocene Valley Trains. That's the name for that ecoregion. Now in Tennessee, it's limited to the areas just at the base of what we call the Bluff Hills, kind of on the far eastern edge of the Mississippi River's Holocene meander belts. So right here in this sort of green region, and it's so imperceptible that you wouldn't even realize you were in this ecoregion when you're on the ground, typically. So here's what those outwash plains, that's what we call these, right? Outwash plains, because as streams are feeding off the base of these glaciers, and you have things like glacial lakes, those rivers are all braided, meaning there's multiple channels to these, and they're coalescing, and they form these flat outwash plains that are flushing out all this sediment and gravel and rock and debris that ultimately is going to the Mississippi River, or at least towards the Mississippi River. If we look at this in terms of what's happening back up north of Tennessee, Then what is this right here? Sarah, what is this in gray, dark gray? What does that represent? Yeah, that's a glacier at one point where it was. What you see there in these other colors in light gray here and in sort of a medium gray are places where glaciers were at other times in history. So as we're going to see when we get a few lectures down the road, we'll start talking about the ice age. You're going to learn that there wasn't just one glacier. There were multiple glacial waves. These different colors represent those different waves of glaciation. The most recent one we had was this one right here in the dark gray. And notice that it didn't come as far south as the other ones did, okay? This one was about 25,000 years ago, 18,000 years ago. And that southernmost edge of glaciation here is what we call the LGM, the last glacial maximum, okay? But the point being is that imagine at the edge of that southern edge of those glaciers, whether it was, 25, 50,000 years ago, or whether it was, 1.8 million years ago, that glacial edge would have had these streams feeding off the bottom of it that would have made the Ohio River and the Mississippi River swollen and large and full of these outwash deposits. Now, I've just sort of combined these two maps together because at the bottom edge of glaciation is the Mississippi alluvial plain ecoregion, okay? So it comes all the way right here to southernmost Illinois, southeast Missouri, here's westernmost Kentucky and Tennessee, eastern Arkansas, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And then the Mississippi alluvial plain is this big section right through here. All that you see there in yellow, these yellow patches, are the northern Holocene meander belts. And then what you see here in pink would be the remnants, somewhat, not all of it. Part of what you're seeing in pink are the remnants of these Pleistocene valley trains, these more gravelly deposits, like you see on the left there. Let's take a look at how you might recognize the Pleistocene valley trains. This is a couple of images here that show cobblestones and small stones here, some of which are, head size and diameter. Other ones have these deposits with a lot of gravels on them. Again, this is all washed down. But based on what I've told you, what else would you expect to find buried in the soil, perhaps, in and among these layers of gravel and rock? Anything else?
Fossils. Bones.
A log, yeah, you would expect there to be some tree trunks in here, okay? So you could potentially expect that. What else? Yeah, an occasional boulder. Keep in mind, this region has no natural bedrock at the surface. I know that's kind of probably hard to think about, but there's no rock at Memphis. The nearest rock in Memphis is probably 1,000 feet below the ground. There is no surface rock, there's no bedrock, there's no nothing. Same thing for eastern Arkansas. There are no rocks at the surface in eastern Arkansas, except for whatever you find in the way of river gravels or river stones that have been washed down river. So if you find let's say a boulder in the middle of one of these fields that is a result of a historic flooding event of the Mississippi River, if that boulder is like 3 feet in diameter, let's say, how'd they get there? Well, it got there because of really strong floodwaters bringing it down. What do we call those? Does anybody know what those are known as? There's a term for those specific kinds of rocks, especially ones that were first carried by the glaciers down to, say, Illinois, and then they were picked up by glacial meltwater and carried, say, to Mississippi. Who knows what the term for those rocks that are carried by glaciers are called? Some of them are big. Some of them are like the size of, minivans and stuff. Now, those typically don't get carried farther downriver. Those stay put where they were dropped by the glacier. Ken? All right. Kiki?
I don't know if it includes any kind of bigger bones or gravel scale.
Okay, so, yeah, this is some of the stuff here. It's related to till, and we're going to talk about till when we get to the glacier section a few weeks out, but it's not till. Well, I'll tell you, I felt like this word I'm looking for kind of symbolizes my entry into class today. You know, I'm just like scattered. I'm looking
Erratic.
for stuff, you know, filling drinks. I'm just acting a little bit, what? Erratic. Yeah, these are called erratics. So the term erratic is these large boulders that are carried. By the way, when I was in Mississippi Thursday and Wednesday, I was giving a talk at the Mississippi Museum of Science, and they had some of these erratics out there in the front yard of the building of the Science Museum. I think I've got some of those built in my talk. Let me see. So, as I mentioned, at the surface level, when you're walking across a landscape, it may be impossible to tell that you are over these Pleistocene Valley trains. Why? Because they now are covered partially with soil and sediment. So at the ground level, they may be almost undetectable, but it's when you dig down into them and you look below that you can see that there's more there. So take a look, for example, here's the Mississippi River right there. Here's Tennessee. This is southeastern Missouri. That's Mississippi County, Missouri, by the way. And if you look right here, you see that area that's kind of a shaded zone that's a little bit elevated? That's an area of the Pleistocene Valley Trains ecoregion. This is kind of what it looks like on the same map from an aerial image. Most of that looks very much the same. You know, is that forested tract associated with this? I'm not exactly sure. But the point for this map is that it's a very imperceptible difference. You really have to look at the soils to be able to detect that. Let me ask Theo real quick, who's on the line, because he does live in Arkansas. And he was the one that first educated me about the presence of the Pleistocene Valley trains. Theo, do you have anything that you can share with us that, from your perspective, is a way to easily recognize when you're in the valley trains versus the Holocene meander belt?
There are parts of the valley trains have
Speak as loud as you can, Theo. Sorry.
parts of the valley trains have a distinctive micro topography to the land.
Okay.
But I think it just has to do with, you know, how much velocity or how much flow was of, you know, when the glaciers melted was running right through these areas. Overall, man, I'd be honest, I have to have a map.
Okay.
There's an excellent set of maps of the geomorphology of the lower Mississippi Valley.
All right. Let me stop you there because they couldn't hear you, and I'll tell them what you said.
Okay, gotcha.
So what he was basically saying is for working in this region, you really do need maps. So you're going to need soils maps or hydrogeomorphological maps to determine when you're over these train deposits or not. There are some what he called micro-morphological or micro-topographical features. So this is meaning that at slight elevation differences, right? Out here on this fairly flat plain, you know, is the difference in elevation between this point here and here may only be 2 feet or 18 inches or 3 feet. So it can be fairly small scale differences. And then you kind of got to look at terrain features. You know, maybe there are some other indicators like these former sort of braided channels that I mentioned. This is where something like LiDAR technology might also be important. You could actually look at the signatures of the sculpting of the land. But anyways, maps are going to be key here. Doing soil sampling is going to be key for this region. Now in this area, there are some really cool sand deposits that are associated with some of these features, like southeast Missouri, Sikeston. There's a restaurant in Sikeston, Lambert's, home of the Thode roll. You know, they throw them at you from across the restaurant, right? You are from Poplar Bluff, so you know about that, yeah. So the sand prairie there at Sikeston, which is a grassland preserve, some of these are thought to be associated with these Pleistocene Valley train formations. They have things like cactus, a lot of species of that are coastal plain plants that are found more characteristically deeper in the south. Okay, and then the final ecoregion we'll talk about before I want to, the very last thing before we give some discussion to the northern back swamps, is we'll kind of take you on out to the edge of the Great Plains. So once we finish this, we'll just sort of do that visual tour, and then we'll connect the dots between the Atlantic Ocean on the east and the Great Plains in the center. The northern back swamps ecoregion is an area that is very fragmented because it's associated with these areas where you have big floodplain swamps of the Mississippi River Valley. On this diagrammatic landscape, you can see where the back swamps typically occur. They're not on the main river, but they're back well away from the river, sometimes at the bases of the bluff hills. And these would be, sometimes there's little feeder streams that connect to these, which are called Yazoo tributaries. I'm not exactly sure why they have that name. There's a Yazoo County, Mississippi, for example. But these back swamps back here, they receive their water especially from what's called overbank flooding. So the Mississippi River, when it gets swollen and it floods out, those floodwaters can extend over and cover large parts of the floodplain and settle into that back swamp. Now, it's in these back swamps where you would expect the finest sediments to carry. So what is the finest particle size of sediments? Clay. Yeah. So remember what's depositing right here on these point bars on the river. Sand, sometimes gravel, depending on how far from the source of the rock you are, but particularly sandbars. Then silt is forming the basis of the floodplain proper, right? That's a smaller particle size than sand. And then it's clay that is carrying the farthest back away. So as those floodwaters are disseminating over that floodplain, the clay particles can go the farthest, and they might settle in those back swamp areas. Here's a picture of one of these back swamps from an aerial view. This is Sunk Lake, just north of Memphis in the floodplain there. So these are depressional features typically, while the rest of the land tends to be somewhat flat. These are slightly depressed down in the landscape, so they're kind of concave, and then they catch water. Historically, though, much of that broad floodplain you see in the back is the alluvial plain of the Mississippi. You know, prior to the days of river flood control and building levees, that entire bottom could have flooded back before the Army Corps of Engineers kind of disrupted that. So a lot of these have swamp forests like bald cypress trees and water tupelo trees. Okay, and because of the fact that clay is carrying into these, then that means that these are naturally very clay types of areas. What soil order do you expect is really well known to be associated with heavy clay? You remember that? Soils that especially like crack vertically and they shrink and they swell. And what kind of, yeah, these are the gumbo soils. And we said in the South, they're only found in just a few places like the Black Belt Prairie and the other places in the big river bottomlands along the Mississippi. Particularly in these areas right here, where you have all these clay deposits of former swampland, is where you get vertisols. You remember that soil order we talked about. This is what it looks like. I'm not sure. Yeah, okay. The reason I have this slide in here is that this has got a link in it that talks about Reelfoot Lake and how it was created because of an earthquake, essentially. There's an article here which you could check out and read. So I put these kinds of links in here for you guys to check out there. So that is one of the big features of the Mississippi River bottoms, is that it is underlain by this fault zone, which is notorious for earthquakes. Some of those earthquakes trigger the formation of these big swamplands like Reelfoot Lake. Part of that happened in 1811, 1812, when the Mississippi River actually ran backwards for a very brief time. And that backward flow, then a couple things happened. One, the areas over the fault zone actually collapsed. So the land subsided or sunk down, creating these sort of concave depressional areas. The river then flowed backwards, meaning that flow was redirected in many ways into these lower areas as the land sort of dropped in elevation. This has happened many times throughout the course of the region's history. So as those land areas dropped, they were high and dry, they sunk down, then they became flooded with these floodwaters that were emerging or running into these areas. This is what it was, an artist rendering of what it would have been like to be on a boat on the Mississippi River during the New Madrid earthquakes of this time period. Here's an aerial view of Reelfoot Lake. So a lot of that area that is today we call the back swamps would have been sort of, more highly elevated. And again, it dropped down in elevation and sometimes a few or a couple feet. And then the river was able to flood that area after it dropped or subsided. A lot of what would have been forest land got submerged. And then of course, many of those areas, the trees would have died. And you would have had extensive swamplands would have developed as a result of that. Here's what Reelfoot Lake looks like today. And other back swamps like Neiman Shelby State Park and Forest. And with that, we have concluded the Mississippi River alluvial plain and its ecoregions. A lot of swampland, a lot of bottomland hardwood forest. In the time that's left for this first lecture, hopefully not more than about 15 minutes, I want to run through, because what we've done now is gone from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Mississippi. And in the time that's left, I want to go on out to the Great Plains right here. And just kind of tell you what's over here a little bit, because that's going to be an important part of some of our discussion as we go forward. So looking west of the river, number one, if you were to leave the Mississippi right here in southeast Missouri or eastern Arkansas or say Memphis, one of the things you'll notice is you pretty much cross some of the same kinds of areas we just talked about. You cross more of these meander belts and you cross some back swamps in places. Here's the Pleistocene Valley trains. But then about an hour west of Memphis, you hit this long, narrow ridge right here. And that ridge is visible in both of these maps. It's sort of like an area that's a long ridge made out of wind-blown sediment. Who remembers what that wind-blown sediment is called? It's called loess. It's an example of a loess ridge. And really it's the same region that we see right here with 73B called the Bluff Hills ecoregion. Basically it's the same, except it's isolated over there, but geologically it's very similar. And the name of that ridge is called Crowley's Ridge. Very prominent feature if you're in Arkansas or in southeast Missouri. And here's Crowley's Ridge right there. It comes up, here's the Arkansas-Missouri line. It's mostly a forested or wooded ridge. And then as soon as you get to the other side of that, you have more of the Mississippi alluvial plain on the other side. So it's quite wide. When you come off that ridge, a big area to the west. Again, Pleistocene Valley trains and meander bars, a lot of swamp forest and a lot of bottomland hardwood forest. Not everything in this region, though, is forested. I want to call your attention to that big block of area right here that's down just east of Little Rock. And you actually cross this when you're going west on Interstate 40 between Memphis and Little Rock. And this region is about 500,000 acres. It's called the Grand Prairie. The Grand Prairie historically was mostly tallgrass prairie, oak savanna, had some marshes in it. This is a photo from about 1903 showing some of the relic prairie out there. Today we've got roughly about 380 acres is all that's left of 500,000. I'm going to come back when we talk about prairie ecosystems in the second half of the semester, and we'll touch on the Grand Prairie. And I'll show you some photos of the modern day Grand Prairie remnants and some videos as well. Here's those meander belts, again, much the same. A lot of swamps. Some of the biggest swampland in the region is out there, like the Cache and White River Bottoms, the Black River, the St. Francis lowlands. Y'all remember about 10 years ago, they thought they had rediscovered the Ivorybill woodpecker in Arkansas? Anybody remember that?
Yeah, well, this is the area where it was cited, was in some of those big river swamps in eastern Arkansas's Delta region.